Okay, great. Yes. Thank you, Ryan. As Ryan said, we're going to talk a little bit about tariffs. I really think that's kind of the elephant in the room, so to speak. That's really what is on people's minds right now. So, just a little bit of an update here, some background. So, February 9th, Donald Trump declared his intentions to impose a 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum imports to the US with no exceptions. This is after about a week ago, Canada and the United States and Mexico had agreed to a 30-day pause on the tariffs that were previously announced. On the 10th, the tariffs were imposed by means of executive order. And the market reaction, really, on both sides of the border so far have been fairly muted. There is a little bit of movement, but really not that much. It doesn't seem like the market is thinking that this is going to be anything. So why don't we just take a little look at the situation here and to get some context on it in terms of really what's happening. So when Donald Trump his new tariffs on steel and aluminum, were not specifically, Canada was not specifically mentioned. These are on any steel and aluminum imports. However, you can see by the percentage of steel and aluminum imports from Canada into the United States that Canada is really the one that is most impacted by this, and is essentially being indirectly targeted. So, especially aluminum. I mean, it's many times our aluminum exports to the United States are many times the amount of any other of the U.S. trading partners. So this is very much something that is focused on Canada. But I really want to take a moment to look at what tariffs are, some of the impacts, and just some of the historical context, because I think that once we do this, we can kind of get a better sense of what's going on, what the risk level is, and really how to approach this as an investor and as a Canadian. So first of all, what is a tariff? Well, a tariff is basically a tax that the government puts on an imported physical good. So if you want to send something into the US, there is a tax on that. Now, who pays this? Well, the tariffs are paid by the company importing the goods. So, if you're a US company, you're importing steel or aluminum, or some other product that has a tariff on it, you pay that amount, and you're trying to pass those costs on to your customers as much as you can. So the benefit of tariffs from the perspective of people that believe in them is that there is potential for increased tax revenues. So the tariff revenue goes directly to the government, so the government can make more money from that. And then there's also government protection of domestic industries. So the government is essentially shielding its domestic industries from competition from outside of its borders, which some could argue would be beneficial in terms of creating jobs, because then those companies have to increase production and hire employees. But others would argue that shielding them from competition essentially gives them the ability to be inefficient and less focused on adding value to their customers. So the adverse impact on tariffs, of course, is that it increases the cost for these companies to bring any of their any goods that they need into the country. This pushes up prices for consumers. This disrupts supply chains. So some of the supply chains between Canada and the United States are extremely complex. They've evolved over many decades. So to just reconfigure them is not something that is very easy to do or can be done overnight. It generally is something that is done at a high cost. And then, of course, there is retaliation. So when you put a tariff on another country, that country generally puts a tariff on you. Now, there are some situations where tariffs actually do make sense. So, for example, if you're trading with a country and the government of that other country is subsidizing a particular industry so that industry can basically undercut your domestic industry, which is not being subsidized, and that's an unfair trading advantage that you're giving a foreign competitor. So in that case, a tariff makes sense just to level the playing field, so that your own domestic companies are not disadvantaged because a foreign company is getting assistance from the government. And this happens a lot in China. And there's other similar situations as well. So in that case, a tariff makes sense. But in terms of just implementing a tariff on any goods that are coming into your country in order to shield your domestic industries, it basically flies in the face of the whole idea of doing the things that you're the best at, so that you can maximize your value and maximize the money that you generate from that, and then taking that and then purchasing other things that you're not good at producing from other people that are better at producing it. Like that's just the most efficient way of doing it. But anyways, in terms of like what the risk is to investors here, so the way we want you to look at this is there is direct risk exposure and there is indirect risk exposure to tariffs. So direct risk exposure would be primarily for companies that are somehow involved in a lot of cross-border trade of physical goods. So if you're selling product to the US, then there would be likely or potentially a direct revenue impact. But also if you're importing other goods from the US in order to produce your own goods, like for example, if you're importing raw materials, then those input costs will increase. So in both those cases, the direct risk exposure could mean lower revenues and higher input costs. And then there's also indirect risk exposure. So this is really what do the tariffs do to the overall economy, right? So if, for example, the tariffs were to impact the manufacturing industry in Ontario, well, the manufacturing industry is very directly exposed to the tariff risk. But if the manufacturing industry has challenges, then that's going to spill over into other industries. The manufacturers might have to lay people off. Those people won't be spending as much money. So all industries get essentially have some level of direct or indirect risk exposure. What that level is really depends on a lot of different things. It can depend on how cyclical the company is, how flexible it is in terms of finding new customers and new supply chains, and also just the magnitude of the tariffs and how strong the economy is. If you have some tariffs that are implemented when the economy is incredibly strong, it may slow the economy down a little bit, but because the economy is already so strong, it might not have a very visible impact. But the weaker the economic situation is, the more of an impact we would expect it to have. So what I want to do is just look at the historical context here, because I think that's really important, because this isn't the first time we've been through this with the Americans and Donald Trump. So we actually went through a very similar situation during Trump's first term. So how did things turn out then? Well, in March 2018, Trump announced 25% tariff on steel imports and a 10% tariff on aluminum imports to take effect June 1st. On May 31st, Canada announced its intent to impose retaliatory tariffs. Now, one thing you're going to notice here, Canada didn't impose the tariffs or make anything official right after Trump made his announcement. They waited until the day before the US tariffs were intended to take effect. So then on July 1st, the Canadian retaliatory tariffs take effect, and they strategically, what Canada was doing is they were strategically targeting products from U.S. states where that were key to Republican support, right? So they weren't just doing blanket tariffs on everything. They were identifying products that would hurt the states where Republicans really needed the support, and this was very strategic. And it was also effective because less than a year later, on May 17th, 2019, US and Canada announced an agreement to lift the tariffs. So the tariffs were eliminated. Then in August of 2020, Trump came back. He said that he's announcing a plan for a new 10% tariff on all Canadian aluminum products effective August 16th. And then, of course, Canada again announced its intention to impose retaliatory tariffs. And then by the 15th, Trump calls the tariffs off before Canada's retaliatory measures can take effect. So we've gone back and forth on this. Now, the tariffs were in effect for a little bit less than a year. But ultimately, things really normalized eventually. And that is largely because tariffs really aren't good for anybody. As I said, there are some good strategic reasons why tariffs make sense, but it really kind of ignores the whole idea of doing what you're good at and then letting other people taking advantage of what other people are good at. And that's how these extremely complex supply chains evolve over time. So there's been a lot of research on it. Some was from, I believe this is the Peterson Foundation. So basically what the research was that tariffs, at least from the Peterson Foundation, is that the tariffs would only create about 8,700 jobs in the steel industry. Some other research was saying that it would actually destroy 75,000 jobs. So it would create jobs for steel companies because they have less competition, and other American companies would go more to domestic suppliers. And this was estimated to result in an increase in overall revenue for the steel industry in 2018 of 2.4 billion. But it raised costs by 5.6 billion. So this is a situation where, you know, you're benefiting one industry, but at the same time, the cost of that the cost far outweighs that. You know, I think of my own situation. I'm trained in finance, so I'm good at finance related things, and that's where I focus my effort on, and that's where I can generate my maximum amount of income. Sometimes things need to be done around the house, like some plumbing needs to be fixed or some repair work needs to be done, and I can do that stuff, but that's not my specialty. So I believe that it is better to bring another plumber into my house to do that work, because that's what or another tradesperson, because that's what they specialize in. And if you look at it, maybe I could do the work, but it wouldn't be done as well. It would take me longer. And I could make the argument that, well, here I'm saving this money. But if it ends up that I'm saving something like $10 an hour, the cost of saving that money is far higher than the benefit. So this is basically the reason why I think that things normalized over time. So now we're at round two. So we're basically right back at it. In November, after the election, Trump threatens 25% tariffs on Canada, citing a wide range of different issues that changed over time. This included border security. In December, Canada announces a $1.3 billion investment into border security. Then on February 1st, Trump imposes the 25% tariff, and Canada immediately announces its retaliatory response. And then the next day, the tariffs are delayed, right, by 30 days until the start of March. So seeming like there's going to be a crisis, but crisis averted. One of the things that the Americans said was that, well, Canada agreed to strengthen the border security, citing the $1.3 billion investment, but that was announced in December. So that was not something that Canada did to essentially get this 30-day delay. So we think we're out of the woods, but then just on February 10th, Trump signs another executive order imposing a 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum imports. Okay, but here's the kicker. These aren't expected to take effect until March. So really not much has changed. And the reality is that the tariffs that Trump originally put on steel and aluminum, that it's called Section 232, that actually never got eliminated, and that actually stayed in force through Biden. But what happened is that there's all these exceptions that they put forth. So Canada essentially received an exception, right? So we weren't, that was when they came to the deal in May, just before a year, the year anniversary of the tariffs. So really what's happening here is it's not even a new tariff. He's just removing Canada's exception, and he's increasing the tariff on aluminum. But what I think that, and this is the reason why the market has such a muted reaction, is that what does this actually mean? Does this mean that the other tariffs, the other 25% tariffs on everything that were scheduled to come in March are now not going to go in, and that these aluminum and steel tariffs will, or that this 25% aluminum and steel tariff is going to go on top of the other 25% tariff? So you're actually going to have even a higher tariff? Or does it mean that they're just trying to dominate the news cycle and create a lot of noise? So I'm thinking probably the latter, because nobody really knows what the intention is, and I don't think that the Americans seem to realize that either. So as I said, there's a lot of different reasons why there are mutual incentives to work something out, and we have seen something worked out in the past. It's this repeated cycle of threats, tariffs, and then working something out. But just one little slide here from Visual Capitalist, which is an interesting site if you wanted to check it out. It's the top export markets for U.S. states. So I think Canada, I haven't counted them all up. Canada's the top export market for around 30 out of 50 of the U.S. states. And if you take a look at this map, most of those states appear to be red states that are pretty key to Republican support. So this gives me a pretty good idea of why these tariffs never seem to stick. And we certainly cannot predict the future. And I will say that Donald Trump, if anything, is unpredictable. So I'm not trying to predict what he does, what he's going to do. But what I'm looking from the track record here is I'm seeing a lot of showmanship. I'm seeing a lot of noise. But I'm not really, when it comes to actual changes, I don't think that there seems to really be a will to make actual changes. It appears to me that there seems to be a will to dominate the news cycle as much as possible. So, what does this mean for investors? Well, I would say um, the market seems to probably have a good sense of this right now, which is why the market's reaction has been fairly muted to all of this. When somebody continues to say things and not follow through, people just begin to become more deaf to it. Now, again, it doesn't mean that I think we shouldn't take this seriously. I think we should take it very seriously. But I also think that Canadians also have to remember that we are not in a weak position. We're actually in a fairly strong position. The U.S. It would be potentially fighting tariff battles on many fronts. And I don't think that moving forward with a policy that isn't going to produce any tangible benefit, but is going to produce definitely going to produce tangible declines in economic output and employment. I just don't think that that's something that anybody has the appetite for. But we will wait and see. The whole point here is, don't overreact. In some ways, when you look at the way they're operating here, it's even almost a little bit pathetic and a little bit of a joke. And we just have to remember that we've been through this before, and we were able to work it out. So
I would say I think, I'm not going to put words in his mouth, but I think the Donald wants a deal. And if he can, come to his base and say, I got a deal, whatever it is, if it
but
makes
again,
sense.
yeah, that's about the
That's,
showmanship as
yeah,
Be
opposed
a
to, like,
hero.
if he can claim a
yeah,
deal and he can claim some type of a victory, like he did with the, like, oh, now Canada's going to invest 1.3 billion
mm-hmm.
into border security, like they already said that they were going to do in December. Yeah, he can make that a victory, right? But it's I think that this is more about the show
Mm-hmm.
than it is about tariffs, right? I mean, well, again, we'll wait and see. We'll have to see what
And
happens. Nobody
there
has a
may
crystal
be
ball.
part of it taking advantage of a lack of leadership near term in Canada. Like
For sure.
if
I
you
think he's
had,
trying to.
yeah, I don't know
Yeah,
if he'll
so
be able
far
to.
unsuccessfully.
Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah.
So we'll see how it plays out. And, we certainly, in our recommendations, we're looking at all companies in there and to see, which companies would have the most exposure. But, many companies are able to either pivot, or some have absolutely zero exposure. Many do. And then some, you could even make a case in some cases that some are benefiting. So, and then there's some that could face issues, but we'll have to monitor that going forward. It's difficult to have a strategy when the goalposts keep changing, weekly.